Hi everyone, and welcome to Season 5 of our A-Level Religious Studies webinars delivered by our Theology and Religious Studies team here at the University of Chester. My name is Stacey from the Outreach team, and I'm delighted to be introducing this event. Our TRS team started doing these webinars in 2020 to support schools during the pandemic by offering free talks and aspects of the A-Level Religious Studies curriculum. The popularity of these talks remains, and the team enjoy it so much that it returns for its 5th iteration. These webinars represent some of the special features of TRS Chester, their drive to use their expertise to support communities outside of the university and to make a difference, their passion for their subject, their commitment to supporting religious education in schools and to making learning both relevant and fun. If you want to find out more about the degrees on offer, please visit our website. The link for this will be in the chat. Do please mention this webinar on Twitter, tagging at TRS Chester and using the hashtag A-Level-RS-Webinars. So let me now introduce our first speaker in this series, Dr. Deborah Casewell, who is a lecturer in the philosophy of religion and works in particular on the 19th and 20th century philosophical movement. The number of challenges to religious language argue that talk about God is fundamentally meaningless and best left in silence. So today, Deborah will challenge us to consider that when speaking of God, we learn how not to speak about God. Deborah, thanks for tackling this topic for us. We'll hear from you for around about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end. Just to reassure the audience today that we at Chester can't see or hear you, and nor can anyone else. To ask a written question, you just need to use the chat function. You should ask questions anonymously and be aware that questions are moderated. You can vote for the questions you like, as well as asking your own, and I'll take that into account as I field them to Deborah after her talk. So I'll hand it over to Deborah to begin.
Thank you very much. And I'm talking today about ways of talking about God without talking about God, kind of strategies within what's referred to as apophaticism. In the A-Level Religious Studies subject guides, you spend a lot of time on religious language, and part of what I want to do in this talk is to unpack some of the reasons why these different approaches are taken, particularly in reference to questions of metaphysics and language. And in philosophy, generally speaking, it covers a lot of areas, but it also wants to talk about things that are beyond just your empirical experience, beyond just what you can see with your own eyes, to things that are beyond the physical world, literally what is beyond the physical, which is metaphysics. And this area explores a number of topics. For example, in my teaching, I look at questions of time and space, for example, personal identity, identity and change. How are you the same person today that you were 5 years ago and will be in the future? Is there any continuity? Cause and effect, necessity and possibility, and quite relevant to what we're talking about now, being and existence. What are these things that exist, and how do they exist, and how can we talk about things beyond just how we can physically describe them out in the world? And the fundamental question of being is, what is it that exists? And if there are things that exist beyond our physical experience, beyond the words that we can use to describe our physical experience, how do we talk about them? How do we talk about these things that exist beyond the physical? And the one way in which that problem coalesces in a particularly dramatic fashion was with talk about God, and the ways in which religious language and religion describes God, for example, as the omnipotent, omniscience, the greatest, being itself, being, and that question of being itself is what's going to be important going forward. And generally speaking, there are about 3 main strategies of talking about God in religious language. And the most famous one is analogy. And again, this understanding, this account of analogy coheres with these questions about being and these questions about metaphysics. And so as God is a being that exists or is said to exist, but exists beyond the physical world, talk about God is considered within metaphysics. And the question then is, what kind of being is God? Is God the same kind of being as us? or does God have a completely different kind of being? And if we have this being and God has that other being, how do we talk about the being that God has? If this being of God is so different, how are we actually able to talk about that? And Thomas Aquinas is seen as one of the most famous proponents of what is referred to as analogical language. He says that we can talk about God, but we have to understand that the language that we use about God is not directly talk about what God is. It's analogical. So language about God conveys truth, but it is not literally true. And so there's two ways in which he says that you can talk about God analogically. We can do it in attribution, that we attribute properties to particular things that mean one thing for us and another thing for them. One of the famous examples is the idea that bread is healthy. The way in which I am healthy is different from the way in which bread is healthy. Bread is healthy because it gives you health, not because it is in and of itself healthy the same way that I am healthy as well. And there's also questions of proportion and proportionality. And again, this links to ideas about God as God's being as similar to ours, but not the same as ours at all. So we are good, or we do good things, or we are moral, but God is perfectly moral. And so the proportion at which we talk about God being good, moral, loving is always going to be greater in proportion to how we talk about ourselves. And Aquinas will in fact argue that we are able to talk about us being good, us existing, only because God is perfectly good and God is true existence, is like, true all being, the causa sui, the cause of all being. And so we talk about God because God has given us these qualities, but in a lesser proportion to how God has it. So that is a kind of a nutshell what the idea of analogy is there. In opposition to that, you have the idea of univocal language, most often associated with the thinker Duns Scotus. Now, Duns Scotus saw analogy fundamentally as incoherent, as a completely irrational, meaningless way to talk about God and the properties that God has. And he says that language should be either univocal or equivocal. It's either literally true, or it allows for a variety of meanings. Again, I'll use the term healthy to describe equivocal reasoning, the way in which healthy has a variety of meanings and a variety of settings. The way in which a carrot is healthy is not the way in which I am healthy. So it has these kind of diversity of meanings that you can say that it's one thing, not to the exclusion of other things as well, or it's just one thing. It's just, truth is hopefully true only in one sense. And he says that when we talk about God, we need to be using univocal language. When we say that God is good, we're not using it in an analogical way, the way that Aquinas is using it, meaning that God is good in exactly the same way that a human being is good. And again, this comes back to the questions of metaphysics, because Scotus thinks that, unlike Aquinas, where Aquinas thinks that we have being from God, but the being that we have is not the same being as God has, Duns Scotus thinks that we have exactly the same kind of being as God, it's just a different degree. So we have like less being than God, but the being that we have is exactly the same being as God has. And so for that reason, he argues that language has to be univocal, and that the only way we can talk about God and have that make sense is for us to say what we mean, for the words to mean exactly what we say they mean and not be analogical or equivocal. But both of these approaches argue that there is a way in which language can talk about God and can access God in some way. But one other approach, found originally found most prominently in kind of the Greek patristic fathers, but present into the kind of the medieval debates about language, is the idea that religious language can never get to the reality of God, and therefore you cannot speak about God at all. All religious language is equivocal, and therefore it must be negated. Now, this happens in two ways. There's the via negativa, which is that you only describe God by saying what God is not. and you get to knowledge about how to talk about God by speaking negatively about God, rather than having any kind of positive attribution in terms of how you talk about God. Because God's being is not the same being as we have, again, it's all metaphysical. God's being is not the same being that we have, so there are no human words or human concepts that can ever describe God. God is beyond all language, and all language terms therefore must be denied about God. And so this takes particular form in apophaticism, which argues that God cannot be spoken of, neither positively nor negatively. Although some people do associate apophaticism with negative theology, which is this idea of describing God by saying what God is not, strictly speaking, apophaticism says that God cannot be spoken of. And to quote another Scotus, this one, John Scotus Erigena, he says, "We do not know what God is. God himself does not know what he is because he is not anything. Literally, God is not, because he transcends being." So even saying terms like God exists and God doesn't exist, God does not exist, are applying human terms and human ideas about to God. So you can't say that God exists. God is, but even saying that God is imposing an idea about God, about something that we can never speak of, because there is no connection between our being and the being of God as well. So why take such a radical approach to describing God and talking about God? What are the dangers in talking about God, and why do people want to avoid them? I'm moving now into a series of criticisms that you find in the 20th century about religious language, but ones that are slightly different from the ones that you've come across maybe before in your religious studies education. And this is to do with an ontological kind of, question, to do with the question of what the being of God is and what our being is. And in this case, there's a sense in which talking about God, the way that Anselm, Aquinas, Scotus do, is dangerous to God, to ideas of God, and it results in a kind of understanding of God that is unhelpful. So even if Aquinas says that you can't directly, literally describe God, they still understand God in relation to metaphysics and being, in relation to this question of things that exist and how they exist. And God is seen as the highest existing being, and all our being is then seen as lesser in relation to God. And so you have then these ideas of God as omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, all good, righteous, the holiest, so on and so forth. And what you'll find in the 20th century, moving in a kind of way that's akin to these apophatic ways of talking about God, or not talking about God at all, the argument is that these are all qualities that humans have and experience, maybe not in their highest form, but in the forms that we have them. We all experience power, presence, knowledge, goodness. We have these qualities, and they cannot literally be applied to God. And so if we want to talk about God, we have to talk about God away from this kind of literal understanding and away from this understanding of being, which says that God is the highest kind of being, the best kind of being, and we have a kind of lower kind of being. Partly because of that, and partly because it leads us to an unhelpful understanding of God as just like us, but better, as an ordinary substance doing things in time and space in the world. And I'm going to quote to you a thinker often known for removing God from philosophy. And he argues in an essay, so Martin Heidegger argues in an essay on Nietzsche's word, God is dead, that the ultimate blow against God consists in the fact that God, the first of beings, is degraded to the highest value. This blow comes from precisely not those who do not believe in God, but from the believers and their theologians who discourse on the being that is of all beings most in being. So in other words, the problem isn't that people are saying they don't believe in God, or people are criticizing the idea of God. The damage that is done the damage that is done to the idea of God, to the concept of God, is done by people who describe God, who give God this category of being the highest of all beings, or the best of all beings, that being that is of all being most in being, of having the most being in the world. And so Heidegger's comment in this essay and another one is that one cannot believe, worship and pray towards a philosophical concept. But the way in which we've talked about God in religious language has just reduced God to a value, a metaphysical value, and to an account of what being is. One of the theologians who takes on this understanding of Heidegger, who takes on this criticism of Heidegger about the God of the metaphysicians or the God of philosophy, is the systematic theologian Paul Tillich, who in his correlationist method stressed that theology must mine the culture to find ways of communicating religiously. And for Tillich, he wants to say not that God is the highest of all beings on a kind of, great scale of being or the great chain of being. He says that God is being itself. God is not one being amongst other beings, just better. But God is being itself and is that which, and is the question to that which concerns us ultimately. So God is he says, our absolute, our ultimate concern. And so to describe the relationship between being itself and finite beings, Tillich doesn't want to talk about God being, but he wants to say that God is the ground. God is the ground of being, the ground of the structure of all being itself. And so God as being itself is not a higher being or a better being, but the ground of everything that is, the question of being itself. So every being that is that everything that exists, every person that exists, has only exists because it draws and participates in the ground of being. It participates in the ground of being itself. And this has something to do with religious language and how to talk about God by not talking about God exactly, because Paul Tillich doesn't want to say that we can ever say anything about God that is literally true. And instead, he says that religious language is symbolic. And these symbols are not just words, they're also things. They're holy books, they're saints, they're doctrines or rituals themselves. And the reason he uses symbols to talk about religious language is that he sees that that symbols don't just point to something beyond themselves or point to some kind of knowledge, but they participate in what they point towards. The example that's most commonly used is road signs versus flags. A road sign tells you something. It tells you that you have to, drive at 20 miles an hour because you're in a kind of more heavily built up area, more densely populated area. But a flag tells you something else, because the flag only has its meaning because of its situatedness in a kind of nation, in a culture. It symbolizes something beyond itself, more than what it directly communicates to you, which might just be colours, for all you know, colours or flowers, things like that. So that's one thing. Symbols participate in what they point towards. And because he sees that symbols are the way of talking about God, they therefore participate in God. They participate in the ground of being itself, and they open up levels of reality that are closed, and the dimensions of the soul that correspond to those levels of reality that are closed off. And so the transcendent level in a symbol is a ultimate reality, being itself, the ground of being, the power of being as being always, in which he talks about God without trying to talk about God, however successful you may think that may be. So he wants to say that you can never address God as God. You always have to talk about God being the ground being, so that you avoid doing what he sees that the philosophical theologians have done. They've reduced God to just a category, one other being amongst many other beings. However, where does that get to? And this is why I find this quote from W.H. Auden, the poet W.H. Auden, particularly important. He says, "I can see what leads Tillich to speak of God as the ground of being, but if I try to pray, 'O thou ground, have mercy upon us,' I start to giggle." So the question is then, when we try not to talk about God, to stop ourselves, reducing God to a concept, do we then lose a whole lot more? And is in fact the best way to talk about, is it the best way to talk about God by not talking about God? Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you, Deborah. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them into the chat using the Q&A function in the top right banner of your screen there, and I'll read those questions out to Deborah. Just while we're waiting for any questions to come in, as mentioned previously in the intro, I'll drop the link in the chat to find out more about our TRS degrees offered here at Chester. Yep, so we've just had a question come in, Deborah. What would you say is the difference between Aquinas' understanding of God within analogical language and Tillich's in his use of symbol? In his use of symbol.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, because obviously you can see that people fall into the same kind of patterns. Because, you know, when you say that you can't talk about something, but you still talk about something, you obviously end up mimicking some of the ways in which people have done this before. I would say the main difference is that Aquinas' understanding of God focuses on language. It focuses on the ways in which we use terms like good, we use terms like being, we use terms like beauty, perfection, so on and so forth. Whereas Tillich wants you to think about language in a more kind of experiential way. That when you use language to talk, when you use the symbolic language to talk about God, you're not just describing categories, you are actually living out something in how you do that. I know this might sound a bit strange, but the way in which you participate in a ritual, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have cognitive knowledge of what's going on. You have an experiential knowledge. Whereas for Aquinas, the knowledge you're going to have is more cognitive. It's more to do with like, how can I conceptualize? How can I think through something? Whereas for Tillich, it's more like, how, when I am doing this, am I living something out?
That's great. Thanks for that, Deborah. If there are any more questions, please do pop them into the chat. Yeah, there was just a question about accessing the recording. Will attendees have access to a recording of this? The answer is yes, that will all be sent out to you.
If there are no questions, it's also fine. I know it was quite a heavy talk, I think, in the end.
Yeah, if there are any more, please do send them through. We'll hold on for a minute or two. Yep, I don't think we have any more questions so far. So thank you so much for that, Deborah, for that amazing talk. For those of you who are currently studying at A-level or equivalent, please can we ask that you fill in the evaluation form that I've just popped into the chat now. Just to let you all know, next week we have our Professor of New Testament and Early Christianity, Professor Paul Middleton, joining us to explore more about the theological convictions behind the Gospel accounts of the birth of Jesus. So please do join us and do come with questions. But for now, thank you so much, Deborah, for your excellent talk. And thank you, our participants, for our wonderful audience for joining us today. Hope to see you all next week. Thank you.